All right. So today's topics for Thursday are the historical causes of diffusion and the contemporary causes of diffusion. So when we think about diffusion, we talked about on Tuesday the different types of diffusion and how different cultural traits spread. We think about historically some of the major causes of that diffusion, and then in today's world, some of the contemporary causes of diffusion. And so just kind of be able to differentiate between those, and both of them have a lot of effect on our world today and the cultural traits that have diffused around the world. And many of them are remnants of things that happened a long time ago, and many of them are remnants of things that are in the process today. So, for 3.5, the historical causes of diffusion, the concept that the interactions between and among cultural traits and larger global forces can lead to new forms of cultural expression. And a couple of the key things that are in this section is language diffusion, and how historically, as people come into contact with other groups of people that speak different languages than they do, there are processes that happen. And two of those processes, especially with language, are the creolization of language and the creation of a lingua franca. And so the term lingua franca is a language that is spoken amongst people of different languages, but they use a common language to to be able to communicate with each other. So people come together, they speak different languages, but they use a common language, and they go to kind of that common denominator in order to be able to communicate. The earliest lingua francas, as cultures started to trade more, in particular across the Mediterranean, the earliest lingua francas were what we call pidgin languages. A pidgin language is a language that is created out of combinations of sounds and words from multiple languages, but it's a very simplified language. So people can communicate with each other, but they do so in a pretty simplistic manner. And they really just use it in order to trade, in order to be able to, do business with each other. When a pidgin language becomes more of a complex language and really becomes a language in and of itself, we call that a Creole language. So the creolization of languages is a historical thing where multiple groups of people came into contact with each other. They started to develop their own language so that they could communicate with each other, but it really developed into this language in and of itself. Um, a lot of when we think about Creole languages, we oftentimes think of the Caribbean because a lot of the countries in the Caribbean call their language a Creole language, so a Haitian Creole or a Jamaican Creole. And that oftentimes is due to the fact that so many groups of people were together. And so we have influence of, let's say, the Spanish. And so the Spanish language, due to colonialism, and many of those regions were Spanish colonies. And so the Spanish language combined with aspects of indigenous languages, so people that are already living there, and also combined with aspects of African languages, due to the fact that many slaves were brought to the Caribbean as well. And so those historical causes of diffusion were those things: colonization, imperialism, contact with indigenous populations, but also slavery caused the diffusion of different cultural traits. And that led to not only changes in language, but also it led to the diffusion of cultural traits, religion, practices, foods, whatever those cultural traits were. The second part, this kind of just goes along with what I was just talking about, but the historical causes of diffusion, colonialism, imperialism, and trade help to shape the patterns and practices of culture. So you should be able to identify some of those regions or some of those ways in which colonialism, imperialism, and trade help to shape those patterns. And so in this map right here is showing you the colonization or the regions of the world that were colonized by other countries. And the time period of colonization, which really began about 400 to 500 years ago, has so much influence on the cultural landscape of our world today. And so, as we take a look and go through this map really quick, so I can't pause it or stop it. But if we take a look, so now this is going back to 1492, and now we start to see the Spanish and the Portuguese influence in Latin America, the British and the French influence in North America. Eventually, the United States becomes independent. We see the colonization of Africa and the Southeast Asia. We see the extent of the British influence and the diffusion of English. All of that has so much influence on our world today. And if we think about some of the languages that have become an official language, the official or an official language of certain countries, oftentimes those countries choose languages of their colonizer. Some of the practices that were brought from the missionaries and the religions that were spread through colonization still impact the cultural landscapes of our world today. This map over here shows the diffusion of Islam, the early spread, the growth of the Muhammad of Islam, and then other time periods of spread. But you can see the regions through the Middle East and Northern Africa with the spread of the historical spread of Islam, and through conquest and war at times, just like colonization and the spread of Christianity, conquest and war were oftentimes a means to spread religion. But also you see the influence of trade. And so when Islamic traders went down here into what they call on this map the East Indies, which is really Indonesia, as throughout the 1200s, 1300s, and further on, as trade extended beyond the Middle East into Southeast Asia, trade was another way that religion spread or Islam spread. Okay, so now moving into the second part for today is the contemporary causes of diffusion. And so when we think about contemporary, that word just means more current things. We think of more modern ways that diffusion happens or culture is spread. So culture, ideas, and practices are we need to understand they're socially constructed. So they are created by people. They change through small and large scale processes. And so a couple of the big processes that have caused the diffusion of culture are the processes of urbanization and globalization. So understanding what those words mean. So here in this right here, we see the term urbanization. And as I've already mentioned to you guys before, the urban geography portion will not be on the AP exam. However, urbanization, the process of urbanization, is a way that cultural traits have spread. So this is a way that the urban geography section could come into your test by related back to in this case culture, or an aspect of economic geography might come into political geography. But in this case, urbanization, which is the process of movement from people moving to cities essentially, and really is a process that really started quite some time ago, but became more increasingly important in more recent time periods. But urbanization causes the spread of culture as people come together and as they migrate to cities and as they come into contact with people of a very diverse backgrounds. That's going to cause the diffusion of culture. Globalization, the idea that we are more connected than ever before through technology, through communication, through transportation, and that has rapidly increased the spread and the diffusion of cultural traits. So some other examples: media, technological change, politics, economics, and social relationships. An idea of like a multinational corporation, so corporations that are spread around the world, American corporations in China or Chinese corporations in America. All those are examples of cultural spread. Okay, and then oh my goodness, I have so many pop-ups right now. Okay, so the last couple of quick things with this contemporary causes of diffusion, once again, Communication technologies, the internet, and time-space convergence. So communication technologies, the internet, which the internet is obviously an example of communication technologies, but your smartphone, all of these things have rapidly increased the diffusion of culture. And then the term time-space convergence. In the AP curriculum, they use this term time-space convergence, but we use the term time-space compression. So just understand that those two things are the same, and just know if this comes up on the AP exam, they might use that term time-space convergence instead of compression that we use in our textbook, but they are the same thing, so you should just think about them in the same way. But time-space convergence or compression is this idea that because of the increased use of technology and transportation, some places have become a lot more connected than ever before. And so distance between two large cities around the world or two global cities is not as important in terms of the interaction between them than it was, 50 or 200, 50 to 200 years ago. So all these things have accelerated interactions. They have changed cultural practices. They've led to the increased use of English, and so because the historical diffusion of English happened due to colonialism and the British colonies, but contemporary causes of the diffusion of English have been the internet. A lot of things, because English is a common language that a lot of people know, they spread their ideas via English in order for people from multiple language backgrounds to be able to read what they wrote or to be able to communicate to other people. And it's also led to the loss of indigenous languages. And so, although there's thousands of languages throughout the world, that number is shrinking due to the fact that people are so much in contact with each other, and the number of languages that they're using to communicate with each other across large distances is becoming less. There's language convergence. Languages are converging, and some languages are dying out. And then cultural convergence, which is really just this idea that people are becoming more similar, and then cultural divergence, which people are becoming more diverse and more different. This is something that we took a look at in our language chapter. We talked about the internet contact by language, how even though in terms of people's number one languages it's going to be Chinese, Spanish, and then English, the vast majority of internet content is in English. And that's because people who are non-native English speakers are using English to communicate across large distances. And so it wouldn't necessarily be prudent for someone who speaks Dutch to communicate on the internet in Dutch or Flemish, because people outside of their small area are not going to be able to read what they wrote, and so they communicate instead in English, kind of become the default. All right, so historical and contemporary causes of diffusion, and tomorrow we're going to take a look at more specifically the diffusion of language and religion, which we kind of already talked about a little bit today already. So have a good Thursday.